apologies.
Thank you, Chairman. We have 3 apologies this morning from Ian Carruthers, Karen Carruthers and Patsy Gilroy.
Councillor Dykes.
I don't know if it's appropriate to bring this up under this particular item or not, but on the front of our papers, and I've brought this up before and I'm going to bring it up again, on the front of our papers we have a vacancy. Now, in my opinion, if that vacancy is held by any political group, which obviously it is, in some shape or another, then the group should be named on the paper, because it is completely and utterly inappropriate, in my opinion, to carry a vacancy for this length of time without any either named person or group beside it. Each group should be putting their names forward. We were told at the last meeting that this wouldn't be carried forward anymore because they had a name and they would be on the papers at the next meeting. Well, still nothing. I don't think it's appropriate.
Claire.
Confirm we haven't had a named person provided by that political group.
Sorry, pardon?
We haven't had a named person provided by that political group.
Councillor Dykes.
Well, in that case, for correct governance procedures, could we please make sure that if we are carrying vacancies, then the political group is named on the front of the papers? Because if that is for a particular political group and they are not putting forward a name, then I want it on the papers. That would be correct governance procedure.
Councillor Prentice.
I think, to be fair to what Jill's saying, I think it's exactly right what she's saying. It was agreed the last time that the political group would be named on the front page.
You take that back, make sure the next time that...
Yes, I can certainly take that back. Thank you.
Councillor Mayo.
Just slightly further on that, I mean, if that political group decides in the end that it cannot fill this position, what happens then? Because we're still one light and really we shouldn't be. Is there a way that can be placed somewhere else, or how do we go forward? There's got to be a length of time, surely, in which a political group has time to find somebody, and I mean, if they can't or don't want to, then how do we proceed?
My understanding there is one other committee whereby it hasn't been possible to fill all the positions, which is the Planning Applications Committee, and there is a permanent vacancy carried on that committee. But I don't know if there's an opportunity for another group who may wish to take that position up to take it off one of the other ones, but I don't know under proportionality if that would be possible. Do I have any declarations of interest? No. Move on now to item 3, minute of meeting at 17th of December 2013. It's here for approval. Members happy with that? No dissent, I take as agreement. Yep. Right. We held a preparatory discussion for today's committee, and there will be, I think, the way we're looking is for a series of briefings to come through. I noted at the last one, I know there's 2 or 3 people unable to attend. It might be worthwhile if we can actually try and attend where we can, owing to the fact that the preparatory committees for the next meeting. This one's maybe not been so bad because of the fact that, as you'll hear later on, a couple of speakers that were meant to be here today haven't been able to attend. But in the future, we'll be looking at new work streams, so if you can make it along, I would ask that you try your best to be there so that we can take things forward. Right. Moving now on to item 4, which is the draft report to full council on the scrutiny review on performance indicators. This is our first report to the full council on some of the findings that we've got to date, and this is, I think, it's the agreed method that we've used, or we've agreed to use, to go forward to full council to bring it to their attention and to get any feedback from them. Once we've agreed the report, I think I'll be taking the report to the leader of the council to give him a sort of heads up as to where we would like to go, and I would look to do that as a continuing way of delivering the reports to full council so that he knows where we are looking at, what we're looking at, where we're going forward, so that everybody's involved in the loop. And also, he may come up with something, or his group may come up with something whereby we'd want to take it on board as something we would want to look into in the future. So, we have the report in front of us. Liz, you're here to answer any questions. So, is there anything further to add to the report? Or
Perhaps just a couple of things. First of all, to highlight that the recommendations are designed to make an improvement, to make a tangible improvement in the area that you have looked at. And hopefully the format of this report, and it is your first report to full council, so your thoughts on that are also welcome, that we've attempted to make sure that the evidence that you received during the report, how you arrived at your conclusions and recommendations, are also explicit in the report to demonstrate for the whole council about how you've come to these recommendations. And perhaps the point about resources, perhaps it might be worth highlighting, and that there are no resources required to implement this, that these are changes to our current arrangements rather than any particular investment being required. So your thoughts on content would be very helpful.
Councillor Dykes.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I'm pleased with the information that's in front of us. Particularly, I think it's quite well laid out, and it actually shows very well the evidence that we've taken. However, I think if people look at page 7 or page 18 of 42 under contributors, we did say that we would look to speak to members of the public as part of our stakeholders. We haven't done that, and I think that we can't send a report where we actually set some criteria when we haven't completed the criteria that we set. And I would suggest, therefore, that this report should not be going to full council until we've carried out all of what we said we would do when we started along this journey. Now, it may be that you determine that you take stakeholders as members of the public by, for example, holding a themed meeting at area committees where you invite members of the public and community councils to that themed meeting. That might be a way of covering that angle. However, I don't feel that it's complete, and I think that we shouldn't send it to full council till we've actually completed everything we said we would do at the very beginning.
Liz.
I have to pick that one up. At the time that you developed the scope, then obviously, yes, members of the public were part of that. Subsequently, the committee had agreed a public performance reporting review, which obviously members of the public are part of that. And the timescale for that is that material will be available later on in the year. So I think when we did the sort of roundup about did you have enough evidence to draw your conclusions and recommendations in this review, I think the committee at the time had felt that yes, it did. But I guess in the knowledge that that wider piece of work about public performance reporting is due to come back to you at a later date. For example, you will have noticed in the broadcast magazine that there was a survey inviting people to feed back to us. So that, if you like, is part of a wider public performance reporting piece of work that you'll see later on in the year. I think that the recommendations in this review at present are more focusing on how the council's dealing with the performance reporting and the material within that.
Well, I hear what you're saying, but unfortunately I don't agree. I still think that before this goes to full council, we should do something along those lines to add in to the report. Sorry, but that's my opinion.
Councillor Wiper.
Thank you, Chair. It's just, I just really wonder if you have a themed meeting, an area committee on performance reporting and performance indicators, how many people will be queuing at the door to come in?
In terms of what Liz has said, Councillor Dykes, this committee has agreed that review of PPR, and that will have to involve the public, and part of that process is looking at broadcast and those sorts of public performance reporting that's going out. Mindful of the time in terms of reporting for this and the change in committee last year, and also mindful of the fact that, notwithstanding members' consideration, the issues around public reporting would be in probably a number of additional points to be made on top of what you're making, because these are comments in relation to the council's business rather than the council's reporting in public. A suggestion to consider is that you recognise that in the report, that you want to do more work on the public, that this work's been commissioned through the Scrutiny Committee already, and it'll be a further report on the public reporting element of it once that's complete. And obviously that'll include broadcast and everything in between, and you've already commissioned that work. So it's not to delay this report going, but to take cognizance of your point that that's a further piece that has to be completed.
Oh, Councillor Maitland, then I'll let you back in.
Thank you. I actually thank Councillor Dykes for drawing this to my attention, because I glossed over that. I hadn't noticed that, and I think it is important. I don't think it's impossible to take this to full council, but as the Assistant Chief Executive has pointed out, it must be made absolutely explicit that that has not been done, and the way that we're going to cover it. But I don't think there's any reason to delay it, but you must make it absolutely explicit it's not been done. I think that's right, to that extent, and the way that we're going to cover it. But I don't think we should delay taking it to full council.
Councillor Dykes.
I'm happy with that, as long as it's very clear on what actually goes to full council, because otherwise we have a remit and we haven't actually carried it out. And, you know, we need to make sure this is the Scrutiny Committee after all. You know, it's the committee that should be scrutinising everything that's done. So as long as we are very clear and we change the recommendations so that full council actually understand that we did decide that these were our criteria, but actually this has fallen off because of X, Y and Z, and that will be fed back at a later date. I mean, we'd be happy with that, but it needs to be done.
Would that be a sort of addendum or into the forward? Or would
There
you
can
rather-
certainly be a number of references to it, perhaps in the forward, the recommendations, and we could put a note as part of the scope to highlight that the public performance reporting element is actually now an additional, it's a bigger piece of work than simply being part of this this review, and just to give that its due profile.
Any other questions? Councillor Maitland.
Well, just things like, now there was somewhere about trend data, which I know that Councillor Wiper is interested in. I quite agree. Because I've come into this kind of halfway through, I'm not totally certain about what level of detail goes into the recommendations about how we're going to achieve this, or is it simply that we are going to do it, if you see what I mean. Can I have a kind of bit of background?
Certainly, I think your role here is to make the recommendations, and then the implementation of it would be for officers to make sure that these things actually happen.
Can I add to that as well? I think in terms of this report, I'm hopeful that those recommendations will be acceptable to full council, but if the committee at some point made a recommendations to full council and some weren't acceptable, it would be presumptuous of officers to describe the how until full council took that decision. So that's the reason we've not included that within, because this is a committee report rather than an officer report.
Councillor Wiper.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if it's the appropriate time to bring this up, but I really don't know when the appropriate time is. But seeing we're looking at performance indicators and the way they're reported in exception reports, I wonder if anybody else thinks that what a waste of money when we have a report in the body of the paper and then we have another copy of that report in colour, separate. You know, it happens time after time after time, and I just wonder, is that something we should be looking at? I mean, the council spends $400,000 a year printing stuff, and I just wonder how much of that could be cut back if we didn't print stuff twice.
That matter's been raised before with the governance officer, and I'll raise it again. It's certainly been raised by other members as well, so yes, I'll raise that.
If there's no further points on that, we're asked to agree the report subject to the inclusion of the points with regard to public performance reporting, with reference either in the forward. Councillor Dykes.
Sorry, I just think it needs to be a little bit stronger, and the reasons why we haven't actually completed the task that we did originally set out to do. And a form of words would be good under the recommendations for that, and obviously incorporated in what goes to full council. I think we need to make sure that that is minuted here so that we know that it's actually happening and will take place.
Are members happy enough that if there's a form of words created, to delegate that to the chairman to accept it?
Yes, Chair, I'll delegate to you to make sure the form of words is correct.
Oh, that's an action for me and for whoever's good at wordsmithing. So, happy with that? Right. Thanks for that. We'll move on to item 5. Scrutiny review on performance indicators, actions and next steps. Report's here to finally conclude the scrutiny review on performance indicators for council priorities. We have the final summary of actions that have been taken. I think other than the public performance reporting that we need to come back, the rest of it's complete. So Liz, have you anything to add? Or?
Just to pick up on your earlier point, we could certainly highlight that the public performance reporting is part of the wider review of that, and just to make sure that you've got that evidence. So we'll certainly make sure that that's added in at the bottom, so that your conclusion of the report has got that evidence.
Councillor Maitland.
Chairman, I'm having an old lady moment. The contributor council services, why did we decide it was no longer appropriate to ask chairs and vice chairs for a round table discussion? Why did we do that? Because we did. I remember we did, but I can't remember why.
It was because of the change of the committee chairs and vice chairs at that time, that to have brought in perhaps or have the conversation with the former chairs and vice chairs was perhaps no longer appropriate, because we were looking to improvements that the new chairs and vice chairs would be expected to make.
In the future, there's the opportunity still there.
Chairman, that's all I was getting at, that we weren't precluding it in the future. It was simply, it was an at that time decision. That's fine, that's fine.
With that, do we note the progress at 2.1, and we're asked to agree the conclusion of the scrutiny review? Agreed?
Agreed.
Move on to item 6, which is the presentation from Louise Matheson, Senior Manager Property and Architectural Services. This is intended to assist us in understanding the procurement of capital projects and to allow us to select some completed capital projects to take forward for focused examination as part of our evidence gathering. Louise, the floor is yours, and you can tell us all about capital procurement.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, which copies of the slides are being handed out just now. and I'll get the presentation started on screen shortly. Just to give you a bit of background before the slides come up, there's 14 slides in the presentation. 2 of them at the beginning cover the terminology that I'm using on each of the slides about the 9 contracts that I've selected following the preparatory workshop which the committee had on the 14th of February. Change the slides. You'll have these in front of you just now, but I'll just very briefly run through just in case there's any of the terminology that members aren't familiar with that I'm using. I'm giving headline information in relation to the main contracts for 9 different building projects that have been selected after the workshop. So on each of these slides I'm using the terminology that's listed there. I won't read out in detail, but I'll just briefly summarise. The main contractor, so that's the party that we've procured to carry out the main portion of the works. The pre-tender estimate, which is the last estimate of costs for the construction works that we do prior to inviting tenders for the works. The contract sum, which is the value of the contract that's accepted at the point of award. It's important to understand that most contracts include a mechanism for remeasurement if there's any variations during the actual contract itself. So therefore the final account figure can be different. It can be greater or less depending on the nature of the variations that have been instructed throughout the contract. I'm using the terminology total project costs. Now it's important to understand that that relates to all of the costs associated with the project that's on each of the slides. So whilst the headline figures on each slide tell you the financial information and dates in relation to the main construction contract, there's always other costs associated, be it in-house costs through our own architects, clerk of works, surveyors and so on, the external consultants that we employ via framework agreements for quantity surveying, mechanical and electrical engineering and CDM coordination, statutory fees, services connections, and also importantly other smaller procurement exercises which often happen as part of the projects that I've listed. Typically that will include things like new furniture and equipment, surveys, for instance, where we've got surveys to do on existing properties that have to be done by specialists such as BAT surveyors. We'll have a small procurement process to appoint somebody to do that. And sometimes we're moving furniture from an existing premises to a new premises. So again, there's a small procurement process involved there. Practical completion, that's the date when the main construction works are finished, certified as finished and handed over to the council to then start using. Partial possession, one of the projects in here that I've suggested has involved taking partial possession of what was in the contract. It's, I think, the second or third slide following this one. Shawhead Primary School, the building for which has recently been completed, and the council has taken ownership of that, but there is still a small amount of works being finished off where the old school was being demolished, and there's external work such as parking and landscaping just being completed, but that contract will finish within the next month or 2. So I thought it might be one that was appropriate to consider based on the discussions at the workshop. And just at the top of each slide, I've mentioned the date that the project commenced, which, just to be clear, that's the date where design work has started on the project in question. So running through each of the contracts that I've given the headline information on here, Beat Primary School was one which I think was mentioned at the workshop a couple of weeks ago. That's one where the contractor is DG First in accordance with following the process under the Strategic Commissioning and Delivery Framework. Now, clearly where DG First have been appointed to do the works, they will then have a series of subcontracts with specialist tradesmen, joiners, plumbers, and occasionally as well for elements of the works that might have to be designed as well. Typically that can be things like plumbing installations, electrical wiring, roof structures. It varies from contract to contract, but typically that's what it can involve if it's a design element of the main works. So that just gives you the headline info there, what we assessed as a pre-tender estimate cost for the works before we actually invited a price from DG first, what the accepted contract sum was, and then the final account figure, 2399. After that was agreed with DG first, and then the total project costs, which you can see involved roughly an extra £415,000 of costs over and above the main contract. So as I say, that's a mixture of fees. It's things like furniture and equipment as well that was purchased for the new school under a separate contract. And then the dates are given there on the right-hand side. Douglas Ewart High School dining, drama, kitchen and lift. This is one which involves working a pretty large contract, as you can see from the figures there, on an existing school building, and over really a period of about a year the construction works were on site, and in fact just over a year. So again, you can see the details there. This is a project which was competitively tendered. We received 8 tenders. I think we maybe invited one more than that who's not returned a tender, which quite often happens once we go through the procurement process. We go through a pre-qualification process to assess who are competent contractors to invite to tender, and then invite a select number of those to tender for the works on that's what would usually happen. Sometimes it can be an open procurement process, but for construction works, given the size of tender documentation that's got to be priced, it's usually restricted to between 5 to 8 tenderers that are invited. So that's one that was competitively tendered. Ashley Scotland Limited are the contractor that was appointed. Again, you can see the headline figures there. Our pre-tender estimate, well, what was ultimately the contract sum, you can see is quite a bit less than the price that we had assessed it at before inviting tenders, although of course it's the most economically advantageous, in this case the lowest tender which has been accepted here. So the range of tenders, there was a I think the highest one received was just over 2.5 million. And again, the dates are on the right-hand side of when work has been completed. The total project costs, they are on the bottom line.
So are you happy to take questions too?
Sorry, yes, I'm happy to take questions throughout. Sorry, Chair.
Councillor Viper.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify, is the pre-tender estimate what you estimate the total project cost, or is it the actual contract sum, or the final account?
That's what we estimate the works will cost, so not the total project costs, but purely the construction works. I'm not quite clear yet why we had such a high estimate, although I do know that this is one where we've allowed an additional contingency over and above the contract sum that was tendered. Sometimes, just purely depending on the construction market at the time, tenders can be quite substantially lower than can be estimated, and of course it can be the other way around as well. But yes, that's purely a pre-tender estimate for the construction works.
And do you actually estimate what the other costs will be as well? You know, if you have the contractor cost of it, do you actually estimate what all the specialist fees would be, and you know, so you get a final total cost? You have an estimate for all that as well, and then you can compare what you thought the whole thing would be and what it actually is.
Yes, we do that, although I think it's important to recognise that historically quite often a budget has been set before any detailed work has been done to assess, well, what exactly is the scope of what's going to happen and therefore what all the costs will be. So sometimes I think members will see an initial budget which can quite often be greater or less than what ends up being the final budget before things go to tender, but certainly relatively early on in the design process and before going to tender, a full assessment is done of all the costs, and usually that's done in terms of fees. For our in-house fees, that's on a percentage basis of the contract value, and for external fees we have framework agreements, so it's therefore they're re-tendered every 3 or 4 years, but it's therefore relatively easy to see what those kind of costs will be, and statutory connections and so on can sometimes be a little bit of a mixed bag, particularly when it comes to connecting services up and so on. We're very much at the mercy, obviously, of the statutory undertakers that are providing water and electrical services and so on.
Councillor Maitland.
Louise, this was before your time, I'm well aware, but can you tell me now, what are the rules about deciding whether or not something is competitively tendered? Because BTEC Primary School, my understanding was that it was not competitively tendered, and I just want to know what the rules are now.
The rules now are defined in the procurement regulations that the Council has. I can't remember the exact regulation, but it does specify quite early on in that document that if there are services that can be provided in-house where there is capacity, that those should be awarded in-house and follow the strategic commissioning and delivery framework that the Council has set up. Clearly, however, we're always looking at the costs ahead of time, so that when we do get a price back from DG First, we can then assess, well, in quite a bit of detail, is that a reasonable cost in terms of current market prices for all the different elements within the building. So there's a process there to assess the reasonableness as well, but certainly it's covered in the procurement regulations.
Just one thing that you mentioned was that budgets are set prior to us going to pre-tender. What input do you as a service have into setting those budgets? Because, you know, are we getting accurate or ballpark figures whereby we're in the right part, or is it just somebody in a service saying, well, it might be about 2.5 million, so we'll go for 2.5 million as the budget?
It can vary, but generally speaking, within what was previously strategic property services, that work happens there based on existing condition data that we'll have on a property. It's obviously a little bit different if we're talking about something that's a complete new build, like BTEC Primary, for instance. But again, an assessment can be made based on the brief that's agreed with the Education Department in that instance to say, well, how many classrooms do they need? What sort of different spaces do they need in the school? And again, looking at site-specific issues, where things can get a little bit, I suppose, different in terms of what the costs might ultimately be, are purely because the scope is yet to be discussed and, you know, really battered out with the client department, because sometimes there can be a perception that, well, we only need to do this bit, whereas in fact if you do something to a building, you quite often have to do other things from a building regulations point of view, for instance.
Councillor Dykes, and then we'll try and move on.
Hi, Louise. I know this is before your time, but I also want to just ask, while we're on the BTEC Primary School topic, can I just ask a couple of questions surrounding that? I mean, obviously, the job was given to DG First, and you didn't invite anybody else to tender for it. Now, can you explain to me then, because I don't quite understand this, we've got your department making a decision to put it to DG First, because they're obviously saying we're capable of doing the work. Now, DG First put the work out to tender and brought their own tenders to the table. to put somebody in to do the contract. So why would we give it to DG? What I don't understand is why do we give it to DG first when then they put it out to tender and you don't invite people to tender? Because DG first didn't bring their own builders onto the site to build the new school. So can you explain a little bit of that to me, please?
Well, first of all, I think it's important, and I've mentioned it briefly on one of the slides here, to recognise that right at the top there, in fact, I mentioned it, that any contract for works will involve subcontracts. It's exceptionally rare that you would get somebody who's doing everything. So you'll get varying degrees of that regardless. Clearly where we've competitively tendered something, the council, if you like, has no insight or say-so or limited insight into what's within subcontracts that have been commercially tendered by the main contractors involved. But when it comes to what DG First are doing, there is, of course, that process to look at how they're procuring things. We simply look at it from the point of view of what I've mentioned is defined in the procurement regulations, and yes, as you say, it predates my time here, but following that ruling, therefore, if DG First say that they are able to do the work, they have capacity to do the work, we obtain a price from them based on the timescales that are involved, which obviously they're told, because something like BTIC is quite a significant piece of work for a long period of time. And then within the tenders that come back, we can clearly see, well, what are the prices within each trade for the different elements of the building, and make an assessment on that basis. And I think it would be fair to say that just because tenders are invited, or a tender is invited from DG First, doesn't necessarily follow that it's always then going to be assessed as being reasonable. There can be then some further discussion following on from that, or in exceptional circumstances, I would suggest it's always possible to then make the decision, well, no, we feel that we could get something better competitively, but I think that would be an exceptional circumstance given what's defined in the procurement regulations.
I've got a few questions.
I think
do
we
you
found
mind?
the subject where we want to get our teeth into it. So, Jill, if you want to, I've got Colin after that, and then Jane.
I can give way to Colin and then I'll come back. I'm quite happy to do that.
Is it same subject, Colin?
It's the same subject. It's maybe taking it just a little bit further. If you look at the tenders on the last page of this, 4 out of the 5 pre-tender estimates, that DG First are involved in, 4 out of the 5 have went well over. The final account is well over what the pre-tender estimate is, to the tune of £200,000. If you look at the non-DG Firsts, 3 out of 4 are actually well under the estimates. Just glance across the last 4 of these, but DG First, 340, 350. One of them's £100,000 difference between the estimate and the. I mean, these are figures that sort of should jump out at anyone that's got a financial head on them. I'm not being critical. I'm just saying I would like to know why it looks to be on a regular basis that DG First are coming in well over what the pre-tender estimate are, and the non-DG First contracts are coming in well under the pre-tender estimate. Is there a reason?
Well, I think maybe just to clarify, first of all, if I run through each of these line by line, on that first one, that's a DG First project. The pre-tender estimate for the works was 2455k. What has come back as the tender amount, if you like, or the accepted contract sum, is less by about 77,000, I think, if I calculate correctly. And then the final account figure, yes, that's slightly more than the original contract sum, but as I say, that is down to changes that are instructed by the contract administrator on behalf of the client in most circumstances, So therefore there's a mechanism to remeasure what's a fair price for that extra work. So the final account figure is still less than the original pre-tender estimate. The next one, that was one that was competitively tendered. I think there's specific reasons that one is a little bit different, and as I say, there was a contingency over and above what was in the tender amounts for some additional work, and that perhaps accounts for the difference. But as I say, there was a tender received on that job that was much closer to the estimate. The 3G pitches, that's a fairly specialist piece of work. And again, the tenders received were of a range where, yes, we've got the one that was accepted at 1.732, but the highest tender figure back there was 2.855 million. So you can see that that's substantially above. The next one, Shawhead.
I was only asking a general question, why DG First appear to be coming in way over the tender amount on most occasions. That's, I mean, if you look at, for instance, the third from the bottom, Dumfries Academy Home Economic Rooms, it's £100,000 of a difference, and if that didn't go out to tender, then why not? Because if they were going out £100,000 over the estimate, surely it should have went out to tender to see if you're getting value for money.
Yeah, on that specific one, I think it's important to recognise that the nature of the project, first of all, because it was doing work in, if you're familiar with the sort of concrete tower block at the rear of Dumfries Academy, in a very restricted period of time, which was during the sort of school summer holiday window, although we did get a bit of extra time just before the summer holidays where we got access to that part for the works. So first of all, it's a relatively high amount of spend in a short period of time working in an existing building. The reason for the increase from the point of award to what's in the final account is because there was substantially more removal of asbestos than had initially been accounted for. Because of the nature of that particular building, or any building of that type, it's quite difficult to assess without ripping the whole place apart in advance, which isn't practical. What needs to be done to it. So that accounts for the difference. Yes, I suppose it's about 51k of a difference between the pre-tender estimate and the contract sum, but it was still assessed and went through a process of that's going to be the most reasonable price that we're going to get in the circumstances of the current market and what needs to be done for the project. The next one down, which is at Carruthers House, that I can specifically say, and again the contract sum accepted is less than the pre-tender estimate. That is one which a contract which has suffered from quite a degree of scope creep, if you like, where there has been extra work added in by the client to what's to be done. So it's not through anything to do with DG First per se. We've added in extra work that we've wanted to be done in that building, and then that extra work is assessed against the rates that are within the contract that we have with DG First.
It would appear to me when we go to the next step of actually doing the sort of review, BTIC seems to be one that we want to get our teeth in to see the sort of contracting, how we did decide how to go through as to who bids in and doesn't. The ones for DG First, maybe there's some way we can look at. There was two examples given. One was Project Creep. That's maybe something that we need to look at to see, do we want to actually focus in on that. The other one was the asbestos and various things. We could look at possibly that as two comparators, along with one that's maybe came in from DG First on or about, to see where the differences are going forward.
Would it help, Chair, if I just went through each of the other slides, because they're focused on the sort of procurement aspects of it rather than anything to do with the scope, which is what's what the committee's looking at. So there's some that I've selected that maybe from a pure procurement point of view would be important just to let you know some of the detail on that.
There seems to be a general consensus coming from this direction of no, they want to ask more questions. Jill?
Thank you. When you invite people to tender, can you tell me how you determine who it is that you invite to tender? And also, another question, I'll just ask them both at the same time. Can you tell me how you put in place any mechanism to secure local supply chains when you're awarding contracts?
In terms of the selection of who's going to be invited to tender, a pre-qualification exercise will be run. So the fact that the contract is going to happen will be advertised. That usually would happen over the last few years. That should have been happening via using Public Contract Scotland's web portal so that it's there for everybody to see. And there's a timescale given to return a pre-qualification questionnaire from each of the interested parties. The assessment of that is obviously going to be down to the nature of the project and making sure we've got somebody who can deliver what we want. So for instance, on that slide there to do with 3G pitches, that's a very specialised thing where only certain contractors are going to have the ability to do it. So in conjunction with the specialist consultant that CCS have that advises on 3G pitches, there were contractors selected to tender there. Plus we received 9 tenders. I believe that we invited 11 in total on that particular contract. So that's what would happen, and that's what will have happened on the contracts there where I'm saying they were competitively tendered. As I mentioned before, each of these will have smaller contracts with it where we follow what's in the procurement regulations in terms of the financial value to obtain tenders. So if it's less than £3,000, which typically it would be for the likes of a BAT survey or a moving furniture from one location to another, for instance, we obtain 3 quotes and go with the best quote that we get. And when it comes to the other procurement that's part of the majority of these contracts, which is external consultants that we use, as I said, that's done via a framework. And again, that has typically happened in the past through use of a pre-qualification questionnaire, going on to Public Contract Scotland and then inviting a select number to tender based on the quality of their pre-qualification submission. At the moment, we're actually in the process of tendering for our mechanical and electrical engineering consultants for the next 4 years, but that's going through an open process where both quality and price will be assessed at the tender return. Sorry, you'll have to repeat the second question for me.
Can I just come back on that then? When a contract is therefore awarded to DG first, do they go through pre-qualification questions when they bring in their own subcontractors?
I would hope that they do, that's the process to be followed. I do not know because DG First is not part of my remit.
That's fine. You've answered my question. Thank you. I wanted to ask about supply chain.
Yeah, sorry.
So when you're awarding a contract, so for example, you award, I don't know, Douglas Stewart High School dining unit to Ashley, how do you then determine when you're awarding the contract that you are looking after local supply chain?
Well, it will vary from job to job as to whether you can, and it's very difficult to enforce that, if you like, because there's no mechanism where you can force a tenderer or the tenderer that you've appointed to utilise a particular subcontractor. That's a contractually
I'm
very
not
difficult thing
suggesting
to do.
that you ask them to utilise a particular subcontractor.
Or even
what I'm suggesting is
even
that
to say locally
within the contract terms, there is an ability to put in some clauses where where the preference would be for them to use local supply chain.
There is the ability to do that. It's not within the standard construction contract terms, but there certainly is the ability to do that. There's also the ability at pre-qualification stage to look within, obviously, the ambit of the procurement regulations that local authorities have to follow, looking at criteria which can be about using the local supply chain, about having apprenticeships and so on. Whether that's been done on any of these specific contracts, I couldn't actually answer that right now.
Jane?
It's a sort of general question. What capacity is there for, should we say, scope creep in a competitively tendered contract as opposed to a DG first contract?
The scope is exactly the same, the opportunity for that scope creep to happen is exactly the same, because scope creep doesn't happen because of the contractor, or it shouldn't be happening because of the contractor. It happens because the client has decided halfway through the work or the contract or the project, actually, not only do we need to do the reception in this building, but we need to refurbish the toilets as well, for instance. So that's where scope creep comes in. It's nothing to do with the procurement per se. And as I say, it's then a decision for the council as the client. Does it want to do these things, or does it want to maybe leave those things to a later date and procure them separately? But there is always a mechanism, because of the remeasurement nature of the vast majority of these contracts, where, providing there's prices for the trades that are involved, the various elements and materials and so on, it's possible to agree a price with the contractor based on those tendered rates that have come in through the procurement exercise.
Could I ask, Ivor, I'm just thinking about Carruthers House, which was a council office, I think that's right, and the connection being DG first. What's the process for saying there's to be any addition? You know, would that be any different, or is it in exactly the same process? It'd have to come back to be assessed through the capital programme. Could I just check that?
I think it's fair to say that with that one, which will have been part of the non-schools asset class, if I just check the date on it, that one would have been an officer-led decision as to whether to do that extra work that came out, and doing it within the scope of what's the complete non-schools asset class budget.
Could we put that one to one side and think about that? Thanks.
That's all questions at this point. We can revisit them at the end of the presentation.
Could I just come in? I think there's a number of the questions that you're coming up with just now, which would perhaps be the sort of lines of inquiry that you want to take when you're actually looking at the examples of the projects. At the preparatory workshop, as Louise said, she was asked to bring some examples of projects which would give you a range of different types of projects that you might want to look at, so that when you're looking at them, you can identify if there are any good practice issues that you might want to change, or if there are any particular problems in different types. So the examples of the projects, and you'd identified, schools, leisure, infrastructure, some new builds, some adapting. So the range of projects here are the ones that you might like to pick a small number of these and do some detailed analysis to see if there's any good practice lessons that you can learn. And I think the issues that you're coming up with just now about pre-qualification, the difference in the final costs, how local suppliers are engaged, they would be lines of inquiry when you're getting into the meat of the ones that you pick to look into. So I think the overview perhaps that Louise is giving us is to allow you to identify which ones you want to really study in more detail in terms of the procurement aspects of them.
We're happy to hear a wee bit more about the procurement routes of these, and then we'll pick out which ones we want to really get our teeth into. Please.
Thanks. I think I've covered that one, the 3G pitches. Important to recognise there that we've got 3 different pitches within that. In some cases with 3G pitches we have procured them separately, but on this occasion we've done 3 together and achieved a fairly good result at the end of that for those 3 pitches. So the dates there, just be aware that, they relate to the latest dates for each of the 3 sites in question, and the sums there are for all 3 pitches together. Although we can look at them on a pitch-by-pitch basis. Shawhead Primary School, that's perhaps a fairly unusual one. That's a design and build contract, and it was Portakabin Limited that have done that building. It's actually not quite finished yet, as I think I mentioned earlier on. The building itself is finished. There's a little bit of extra work to do, and that was done via the Government Procurement Services Framework Contract, which is a central government contract that enables authorities to access things that they've already procured centrally.
Councillor Prentice.
Ask a couple of questions on Shawhead, actually. I see the date says the partial possession of building element, 6th of January 2014. I presume that would be the start of this term at school. Who decided upon that date of the 6th of January? I'll give you the reason in a minute why I'm asking that.
Partial possession is just taking part of a very specific part of the project, so that will be defined in the partial possession certificate that's issued by the contract administrator on the project. Now, if I go back to the very second slide, third slide, sorry, if you look at the section there about practical completion, each contract will have a contract administrator, so that is an impartial party that's there between the client, which is the council, and the contractor involved. Now, that contract administrator role, under the terms of the contracts, the standard forms of contract that are used, that's a named party, which is now me, was previously the architectural manager in DG Design, and the function is carried out by the principal architect or a member of their team. So what happens in practice is there's a definition of the building and what is expected to be delivered of the building. Now, it's only if that is met and the contractor has met their obligations to meet the specification to deliver what's required, that the building is operational, that it was possible to take partial possession of that portion of the building. And as I've said there on that slide, in that sort of fairly lengthy piece of text, partial possession in this instance is the equivalent of the practical completion of just the new building at Shawhead. So therefore it's possible to take possession of that, even though the contractor might have to go in and do various little bits and pieces. It's sufficient enough for the council to actually use the premises to make use of it.
Just come back in that, because the good people of Shawhead, while they're very appreciative of what they've now got, I think they would have preferred to wait for maybe another month before they actually moved in, to let the contractors finish basically what wasn't finished. There were no telephones in, there was no computer points, and I think there was a feeling within the parents and the villagers that it would have been better just left for a month for health and safety reasons, because they didn't like the idea. This is what I'm hearing. They weren't particularly enamoured with the idea of their children going about in this new build school with bare wires and things like that still lying about, and contractors coming in into classrooms fixing them. Another month would have made a big, big difference.
Well, we can certainly look at those specific issues, but I think it's important to recognise as well that just because the council decides it's going to take possession of that building or that it's going to deem the works practically complete, that doesn't mean to say that the relevant client department, in this case education, have to start using it straight away. That's a separate decision to be made by them.
You know, I was at a meeting the other night in Shawhead, and that was the sort of general feeling that they would have been, they're very appreciative. They think it's a wonderful place now, but it would have been better if it might have been left for just another month to let things get better finished. Put it that way.
Councillor Brodie.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just mention that, well, this is fresh in my mind, so it can be picked up later, about information supplied to councillors at the committee stage when we're considering these, whether to go ahead with these projects. The Shawhead, I'm informed that the cost per pupil is very high, but that information wasn't given to the Education Committee when we procured this. So it was put forward as a great idea, but subsequently appears that the cost is a lot higher than what would be expected per pupil across the board.
The next project, Sail West, again, that's one that was competitively tendered and has gone very well and delivered a good product, what we wanted at the end of it. I think that's probably true to say with all the projects that I've mentioned, but that is one that's gone very well. Castle Douglas High School, a vocational training unit there, again, that was DG first. You can see the figures there. What the pre-tender estimate was, contract sum, final account, and the total costs that have been incurred by the council to deliver the whole project. The Dumfries Academy refurbishment of the home economics room in the tower block, which we've discussed already at length. Carruthers House, we've discussed already. The procurement of that, as I say, it's followed the processes, but there has been changes through the course of the contract that the client has chosen to make. Stranraer Community Justice Workshop, again, that's DG first, and the dates are there for you to see. There was 2 other community justice workshops done, procured in the same way, at round about the same time. That's the summary sheet which we've looked at already, so that gives you the overall flavour in terms of the pre-tender estimates and what we've actually got following the procurement process, i.e. the contract sum. And the next steps there, that's essentially what's in, I think, paragraph 4.1 of the report that's before you accompanying this presentation. And focusing in on a select number of these to look at the procurement processes, if they've been delivered in line with procurement objectives, and then see if there are any lessons to be learned from the select number that are chosen. And I'm happy to take any other questions that there might be, Chair.
Councillor Riper.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to sort of back up Councillor Dykes about the local procurement. I mean, if we're spending millions of pounds refurbishing properties in our area, I'm reliably informed by my colleague next to me that it can be written into a contract that local suppliers are used for a percentage or whatever. It needs to be written into the contract. There's a lot of money to be going out of the area when we're trying to actually improve our area and improve the employability and the jobs in the area. So, I mean, it's a big issue that really needs to be taken seriously and, you know, looked at in depth to make sure that we are trying to keep, just to try and keep the jobs in the area as much as possible.
Anyone else? Councillor Maitland?
I was just going to say I found this gripping, so thank you very much. Really interesting. And I understand where Liz is coming from with respect to the lines of inquiry, which I think if we can go through those afterwards as to what we'd like to come through. As a starter, could I ask, I don't know, Chairman, whether you're at this stage, but I would certainly like to ask you to put onto the list the Carruthers House internal alterations. It's one of the ones that I'd like to have on.
Councillor Maitland? Dyke, sorry.
Are we at that stage where you want us to select? I'd quite like to see a number of these, but I'd like to see Dumfries Academy. I think that's of interest.
Brown Hall.
There are some obviously areas that we maybe know of through other committees, and I just wondered. I mean, obviously they're not here. So, for example, Brown Hall School, where we all know there was a huge overspend at Brown Hall School, and I would quite like to see that at committee, scrutiny committee. I don't know if that's acceptable.
Chair, the reason that Brown Hall wasn't included and also that Hardthorne Road wasn't included, and this was discussed at the workshop, is that these have already been looked at by other committees. Education Committee did carry out a review of Brown Hall Primary School. There was a post-occupancy evaluation done, and at Hardthorne Road there is a report that's been prepared on that, a review that's currently sitting with the Director of Social Work. So they have been reviewed quite extensively, and I gather that the remit of this means that things that have been looked at already can't be looked at again. I did discuss with audit to be clear that none of the projects that I've put forward have already been under their radar as well.
Maybe we could look at the findings that came out of the Education and Social Work Committee's review of them to see what they found as areas, so that could inform further what we do. Rather than looking at exact projects, what were the outcomes and what sort of, maybe we could get the recording of the meetings to see the sort of questions, etc., that were asked to actually probe into the areas that caused issues. Councillor Dykes?
Sorry, I am well aware that they have already been looked at committee. However, this is the Scrutiny Committee, and I don't think that should preclude us from looking at the findings of the other committees, because that would really be our role as a Scrutiny Committee. And I would be very much in favour of bringing at least one of them to this committee, looking at the findings, checking what's been asked via the pod link, etc., etc. I think that's very important. We're trying to build up a full picture here, and I think it would be important for us to do that, and I would certainly be keen to suggest that we do.
Bring Richard in, then I'll ask Lon to comment.
Yeah, I think that would be a good idea, but these two can be a starting point. They're a basis for the work we're going to do next. Louise must have read my mind, because at the Social Work Services Committee last week, we're going to procure another community justice workshop up on this dale, either at Kirkconnell and Sanker, and I suggested that the Social Work Committee itself should look at the previous 4 projects, including the Stranraer one, to see what lessons could be learned, so that this project can be as good as it can be. So I'd propose that one, Stranraer one, as one of the projects we look at.
Lorna?
I think it's reasonable for members to look at Brown Hall, I think was the name you gave, in terms of education. So if Education Committee have looked at that, I would imagine Education Committee have looked at it for a different reason in terms of the delivery of the project. This committee is looking at procurement and the tendering exercises, and indeed the subcontracting and delivery. So there might be a crossover in terms of what they were interested in and what they looked at. And I understand Hardthorne Road, there is a report due through the Chief Social Work Officer to the next Social Work Committee. So once that's been taken, then some of the work will have been done on your behalf, and you can take that and look to see what else you want to do. I don't think it stops you doing it. I think it's just helpful to let that see its course out.
Can I just make one other suggestion? I'm conscious of the fact that we've asked for a couple of DG First contracts to come forward for us to have a look at. Can I just suggest that we maybe take the Ashley Douglas Stewart High School one as well? Because then we're looking at sort of one in-house school one and one outsourced school one. Good. I think it would be helpful just maybe from a comparison point of view, I don't know.
Have we got 3 or 4 projects? I think that was 4, is it now?
You've identified 4, the Carruthers House, which is an office project, 2 school ones, which is Dumfries Academy, 1 in-house, and Douglas Ewart, which is an external, and a social work project, which was the Stranraer Community Justice. And if you want to look at the procurement aspects of Brown Hall and Harpthorne.
Right. Are we at the lines of inquiry and where we want to go now? So, now you've got a few written down. Do you want to give us a brief resume so that if there's anything else that we want to
pick up? The difference in final costs would be one line of inquiry. How pre-qualification is carried out, how the local supply chain is promoted or built into any procurement. The difference in final costs, how pre-qualification exercises are taken forward, how local supply chain is promoted or built in, and I don't know, the Vice Chair had talked about how information to members is presented at different stages of procurement. Would that be one area to look at? And then the monitoring and evaluation as you had identified in your scope.
Colin and Jane.
Thank you, Chair. I did indicate to speak on the previous before we got to here. It was just about Brown Halls. I was on the education, or still am in the education. I was at the meeting that it was discussed, and it wasn't really about procurement, and there was mutterings about the price being over, etc., etc. But a lot of it was blamed on a breakdown in communication between education and architectural services, and that is something I think you should be adding to the list to be looked at. The way departments communicate with each other, so that the one department understands exactly what the job entails and what is required from the outcome.
Jane.
It was to do with the issue of who makes the decision when you've got scope creep. That's, I think, what we're interested in knowing. How, and whether there is any system for making certain that it either comes back to members or doesn't. And I'm not completely clear what would or would not come back to members. I think we need to look at that, Chairman.
Sometimes wonder if, when we actually go out to start, if you take scope creep, did we actually assess what needed done at the beginning? And, we should have actually, if it's cheaper to do the reception and the toilets, and we get a benefit out of doing the two together, yes, it may be more than doing just reception, but it'll be cheaper than doing reception and bring them back in later on to do another one. And it's how we actually make sure. I know the asset management plan's meant to help us with that, as this needs done or that needs done, we need to get rid of this and buy that. But how does that get put into the paper so that we can see it? Would that cover the sort of scope as well? Right, I've got Jill and then I've got Richard.
I was just going to use the words contract management, because obviously if we are giving a contract out, then we have somebody, or should have somebody in place to contract manage that from the client's point of view, if you want to class us as a client. So I think that it's important that we look at what we do surrounding contract management as well, because that would take us through when we made our decision and then our end product and how that actually works. Because when a project's been done and carried out correctly and being contract managed, then we should be aware through the contract management side of things of any change in scope creep or extras, as it's known in the trade or whatever. I think it's important that we look at that.
Just to agree with that, and what people were saying, I think you've got to know how good our procurement process was at the start in the planning stage, where all the parties involved in the initial design. You've got the state, you've got things happening where structures are built at schools. The school hasn't been involved in the planning process, and perhaps because of that, then the needs of that project aren't really identified, and then there's scope creep, as you say. So it's how good that process is at the start and how well it's managed during the contract.
No, Councillor Maitland.
No, I actually, having sat in various parent councils and listened to people complaining that that there didn't seem to be a tremendous amount of connection between the school and the people who were going to do the work. Now, I don't know whether that's right or wrong. I'm not making any statement about that. I'm simply saying that is what is happening. I think Richard's absolutely right. I think we would like to look at how the thing is, how a project is scoped out to begin with. I think probably in the consultations that are offered, just in that terms of that process. The last thing to say is that you said at the very beginning that DG First would be offered and would get work on the basis of definitions in our procurement regulations. And I think either I need to have somebody assist me out with the committee to explain why that should be, or if members are interested in knowing that, I think we should maybe have that as a line of inquiry as to why that happens. I think that's quite important to understand.
Well, we did try to change that through committee structures, and we're only allowed to slightly amend it. So, you know, it has been back. We did look at it under committee structures, and it was slightly amended because I, in particular, made representation and was very concerned about the wording in that document. But it came to full council, I think.
Chair, could I just point out something in relation to the discussion that's been had on education projects and discussions with stakeholders and so on? From the Brown Hall POE report that went to Education Committee, there was actually a recommendation that something be brought back to Education Committee in terms of the process of engaging people and scoping out the project. I can't actually recall the exact wording of the recommendation, but there was certainly something agreed to that effect. Specifically education projects, of course, that can be an issue on other projects.
Right. I feel that we've got a few lines of inquiry there. However, one of the ones we were looking at is scope creep, and I have a feeling that we might have a scope creep when it comes to the review. As we get our teeth into it, we might just see other things that sort of catch our attention that we haven't thought of today. Is there any other lines of inquiry so that we can set the scope straight away rather than suffering from scope creep?
Chair, are we allowed to look at something that is continuing at the moment or not? Yeah, because it's just that there have been, while the working on the project seems to has been fine on the Langham primary project, there have been issues literally from over several years to do with things like 3G and other things within that I think there are lessons we need to learn. The school itself is looking wonderful, and the company are doing a good job and keeping well in touch with school councils and things, but I just wondered as an overall project if that one could have been looked at. Now, maybe it can't because it's ongoing, but
I think this review is looking at procurement and tendering and engagement processes. So if it was something specific there, then I think it's reasonable for members to look at that. But if it's more about the build itself and something within that, or the scope of that in terms of changes that have been made, then we could look at that in terms of procurement. The creep that's been mentioned before, but I think it would be helpful be able to look at some co-projects as well. I think that's helpful for members to have a good look at.
Chair, in that case, is that one I can stick a marker up at some time in the future? That might be something we could look at.
Right then. Lorna.
In light, I'm looking at Louise, and she may or may not welcome this. In light of the detailed discussion and the 4 projects plus the other 2 that you've selected, I think it's important that the information on those projects comes back to this committee in a formal sense. But I do think it would be a good opportunity for members to perhaps sit with the team and look through and ask detailed questions with, I'm sure there are vast amounts of paperwork and information that you wish to examine and speak to people on the ground about. And we could arrange some short sessions with members to do that in advance of committee, so that there are areas you can see and touch some of the information, and indeed maybe go and look at some of the builds themselves, if that's helpful in terms of understanding what was commissioned as part of the processes. So it's just a suggestion about how we conduct this before the next committee, to assist you in the level of detail that you've went into, maybe be more helpful in answering some of the questions in advance of committee and bringing that back.
I think there was the sort of idea that we, as well, we might break up into smaller groups if we wanted to do bite-sized chunks and then bring it all back. I don't know. I think it's down to the fact that when we did the reviews of and site visits to East Ayrshire and was it East Lothian, it was difficult to organise diary times, but it may be that we can, if there was 2 or 3 members doing a specific piece of work, it might be easier.
We could
Dykes and then Councillor Maitland.
split into 2 groups if you wished, and maybe feed back on our findings, if that was of help. I'd just like to say, Louise, thank you very much. I actually thought what you presented this morning was extremely useful, and it's helped us a lot to kind of come up with where we want to go. So I'd just like to say thanks for that.
Right, so if we go to the recommendations, 2.2, agree to take forward focused examination of the procurement of a select number of major capital projects. We've got a list of those, 4 plus the 2 other ones that we're going to bring on as well. And consider the information and evidence this provides to the committee's review on procurement and commissioning. Well, we're going to take further evidence on that when it comes forward, so happy to do that. Move on to item 7, scrutiny review on procurement and commissioning actions and next steps. Report enables the committee to review the work programme for the procurement and commissioning review and confirm the way forward. Liz, you here to answer any questions or any suggestions? And nothing further to add. Anything, members? Councillor Dykes.
Obviously, I wasn't at the meeting, but I did put forward some suggestions. And in particular, I had asked if there was any possibility of looking at the waste management strategy and the waste management contract. I mean, obviously, there's been some huge changes that would have to be taken without any public present, I'm sure. And I just wondered whether or not the committee felt that that was a possibility.
My understanding that is some of the new work streams, and that would be coming to future committees. This is actually just looking at the current one, which is the procurement and commissioning, and the way forward for that. It's in the appendix. because there's 2 or 3 suggestions made that day of items that we would like to look at. They were put forward and they're in someone's notebook somewhere as to where we want to examine various issues. So with the appendix, is there anything that we wish to look at?
I think we'll certainly add in from your decision at the previous report there about looking at these specific capital projects and about having small groups and going to visit them. And I think also at the preparatory workshop there was some discussion, if appropriate, when you're doing that, about going to visits to other councils. Perhaps if there were similar projects or there had been similar reviews undertaken. So certainly the officers will come back to that now that we know which projects we're looking into.
Councillor Maitland.
I think we should actually, as a committee, decide whether or not we are quite prepared to be absolutely non-precious about this. If there's a carload going, the date set, then you know, we're not all going to say, "Oh, can I do that?" and "I want to come," etc. Sorry, let's not do that. Let's just agree that there is a date and there is an option to go. And if you can, you can. If you can't, you can't. Yeah.
Yes, I'm happy to endorse that method. It makes life easier, I think, doesn't it? Take the smile off your face, please. Right. With that, there's nothing to add to that one. And we're happy to note the progress and actions taken so far. And review and agree the next steps for the scrutiny review as set out in the appendix. Happy with those? The additions and the fact that we're not being precious. If you can go, you can go. If you can't, can't. I have no further business. Can I thank you all for your attendance today?